think it's important for us to keep in mind that when we're talking about the arts stand as what they are, and we bring meaning to them by imputing meaning to them. For instance, you take the subject of an idol carved out of stone or wood. You carve it and you put it down and you worship it, but it has no power. It's just a rock or stone or a piece of wood. But if you decide you want to worship it, then you give it something that it doesn't have, but you think that it does. And so the same thing with a piece of music or painting or a piece of drama or a movie. You can have a Christian theme to it, but a Christian theme does not make the movie Christian, because the movie is only a movie.
The idea of a Christian movie has become more particular because we have companies that are Christian companies and try to make movies specifically for Christians. And that's a great thing, but in the past, I don't think it was such a dichotomy. I think a lot of movies were just made by normal movie houses that we would still think of as good Christian movies. I think the primary goal of a Christian director should be to make a great movie.
When I think about the primary goal of a Christian director, I think about what our culture needs. And so I think our culture is isolated. I think our culture is fat. I think our culture is technology obsessed. And I think that our culture is oversexed. And so when I consider what the primary goal of a film director would be, I think about how can film help with those problems. And mostly I think that film is contributing to those problems. When I think about sitting in front of a film for 2 hours doesn't make us less fat. Filling our mind with images of beautiful people doesn't make us less oversexed. The film culture is about 3D or special effects or the sort of glorification of technology, which doesn't help our technology obsessed culture, and it doesn't help make us less isolated.
When we talk about what the goal of the creation of a piece of art is, I think we're wise to first start with the Bible. And I don't think there's any better place for an artist to start in thinking about creativity than in Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. This is my goal as an artist, and I think it should be the goal of every artist who calls themselves a Christian, that we have something to say in terms of what we're doing. What we need to do is true, right, and pure. And the way we do it is with the concepts of being noble, lovely, and admirable. That is a challenge in a dysfunctional and disordered postmodern world. But I think Scripture calls us to this.
I wonder whether or not, if I was thinking about what kind of a film would glorify God, I would want to think about why I wanted to make films, right? There's a ton of glory in films, right? And the question is, it's a celebrity culture that we live in, a glory culture. And the question is whether or not I was making films for God's glory or my own glory, right? And, whether I was falling into the seduction of making films because I wanted to be celebrated.
It's interesting for me, having lived over a couple generations now, because in that I've seen the progression of movies. There were two things that I've noticed have changed. One is there was often a picturing of a people or families that weren't necessarily true of the way families really were. Say on a television show you have a Leave It to Beaver or a Father Knows Best, that never showed parents having a true argument, or the way the children got in trouble were just the goofy ways they got in trouble and not the necessarily devious and sinful ways. And while they were fun to watch and enjoyable, you didn't get the reality of what goes on in life. Um, and yet, as television and movies have progressed, you have this what seems to be gratuitous violence or profanity or sex, where that seems to dominate, as if the depravity of man has gotten as bad as it possibly can be, and that's the only thing that you're about, and you don't see God's common grace that is amazingly active in a sinful world.
Artists often say, well, my art needs to reflect the world that we live in. And the world that we live in is dark, and it's messed up, and it's dysfunctional, and it's disordered, and it's horrible. And therefore my art will be those things. And therefore we have music that's very dissonant and rhythmically unstable. And we have films that explore the dark side of humanity. And we have plays that do the same. And we have art that's abstract and is not designed to have any particular meaning except to provoke. Yes, those kinds of art do reflect our contemporary society. But the question, I think, for the Christian is, well, what is the purpose of our art? Is it to elevate the viewer, the listener, the participant into wanting to better society and redeem it even through the power of the gospel? Or is it simply to reflect its dark side and then leave us at the end in even greater despair than we had before we viewed it or listened to it?
I also think that when it comes to sex or violence, I like what you're probably too young for Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose. I used to do a little, but a little wouldn't do, so a little got more and more. You know? So I think that's the case. That you get increasingly desensitized to anything that you might at one stage have had a higher standard for.
So I think in movies, sex, violence, and profanity in a modern movie are pretty hard to do without completely. However, they can be done tastefully or suggested, off stage, that sort of thing, the way that movies used to be. A lot of things are by contrast. So, for instance, I'll give another example, because I like examples. In a movie I saw recently, I think there's one profanity in the whole movie, and it really jumps out at you and makes this point because it's so shocking.
When I think about sex, violence, etc. in movies, I think about whether or not there's such a thing as acting, right? Does acting exist? If you're, under what circumstances is it okay for that guy to be kissing that girl? It's okay because we're pretending or we're acting, So I'd want to think about that first, regardless of its effect on me, the watcher of the film. Somebody has acted that out.
When you think about themes of sex and drugs and violence and pornography and all these different kinds of things that are ubiquitous in our culture, I have to ask the question, well, to what end are you utilizing those in your film or in your play or in your art?
Our goal is not to go through this world without being exposed to anything bad. I think, when I think about Jesus and the foot washing story, right? He's telling them, you're out in that world, your feet are going to get dirty. You're clean, but your feet are going to get dirty as you kind of go out and through the world. But I don't think our goal shouldn't be to try to get dirty. Our goal should be to try to stay clean, but we should recognize that as we go out through the world, we're going to get dirty. So I'm not afraid of getting dirty, being exposed to, people swearing or half-naked women or whatever, which is what happens as I go through life. But I don't know that I'm trying to seek them out.
God revealed himself to me many years ago at a coffee house where I went kicking and screaming by a friend from school, where I saw the movie The Cross and the Switchblade, the story of David Wilkerson. And by today's standard, that movie was as hokey as it could be. It had Pat Boone in it, and it was about gang life in New York City. And this was a film made by a director who was a Christian, who was depicting the bringing out of darkness into light of a gang member who then went on to change thousands and thousands of young people through the Ministry Teen Challenge. And he made that movie without a single bit of profanity. Was it realistic? Well, I don't know any gangs that don't use profanity. But the profanity wasn't needed for God to affect my heart and change me and reveal himself to me.
I do think that sometimes critics get blinded by their ideology, and they're looking for things to criticize. So to them, it's not realistic because the character has this strong faith and is a good character. That's not realistic. How can that be? Because they don't know anybody like that.
For years, I've heard the complaint that Christian films are not realistic or are not well made. And being older and seeing generations of films, I think that's been a pretty true complaint over the years. And so it's been a joy for me to see, especially in the last years, movies that don't have to have an altar call, movies that don't portray Christians as never having any problems, movies that don't portray Christians as sinning, movies that would portray the non-Christian as totally evil without common grace. And I think we almost manipulated people in the past. And then it came up with an altar call that seemed fairly fake and pushy and not always well placed. I think with great intent, but not talking about the reality of how we are as people and how we interact with each other.
I think we often get tied up in thinking that we control the outcomes of any work of art. When we as artists make art, we make it and we put it out there. We don't know who's watching or listening or viewing or listening to it. We have no idea. We express it, we put it out. We don't know the stories of the people who are watching it. If some ridicule it and laugh at it and say it's cheesy and it's hokey, okay. But you know what? A cheesy, hokey movie was God's instrument to call me to himself.
I guess I do feel like good can be the enemy of great. So a oversimplified presentation can inoculate someone against a more sophisticated thinking. And so I guess you'd have to think about whether or not what you were portraying was kind of reductionist and, was oversimplifying something that's more complicated and would require a better, more full treatment.
It's a mission field to be a part of it, to keep your Christianity and to spread faith, not by hammering people with it, but just making it a part of everyday movies. The way, take an opposite example. It was not so long ago that you would never see homosexuality in a movie, and now it's all over the place. Because the idea was to make it commonplace so that people would accept it. If we could make Christian faith, Christian characters, pastors, believers commonplace in movies, even though that's not necessarily the focus of it, it's just part of movies, that would do a lot for improving the whole cultural scene, I think.